Today's lecture is underwritten by the William and Julia Clinger Lectureship Fund. Bill Clinger served in the United States House of Representatives for 18 years, from 1979 to 1997, representing his hometown of Warren and all of Northwest Pennsylvania. In Congress, he chaired the House Committee on Government Reform and Oversight. Mr. Clinger has been a political science fellow at Harvard University and Johns Hopkins, which honored him with the Woodrow Wilson Award in 2006. Clingers have been active participants in Chautauqua for many, many years. In his youth, Bill Clinger, a third-generation Chautauquan, worked at the Daily and then later served as Commodore of the Yacht Club. After retiring from Congress, he served as an institution trustee from 1997 to 2007 and as chair of the Board of Trustees from 2001 to 2007. His wife, Judy, is a member of the Bird Tree and Garden Club, a life member of the Friends of Smith Memorial Library, and a member of the CLSC class of 1992. This fund was created by current and former members of the Institution Board of Trustees and Foundation Board of Directors to honor Bill Clinger's service as chairman. Please join me in thanking the Clingers for their extraordinary service to Chautauqua. We've heard this week from all manner of perspectives on American identity. We've explored the state of America's national identity through portraiture, historical and systemic racism, the optimism seen in individual communities, and the rise of an individualistic culture. Today, we welcome a perspective on identity politics, political tribalism, and ideas for how to bridge the deepest divides between Americans. Amy Chua is the John M. Duff Professor of Law at Yale Law School, where she has been a past recipient of the law school's Best Teaching Award. Professor Chua's most recent book is Political Tribes, Group Instinct and the Fate of Nations, which offers a prescription for reversing American foreign policy failures and overcoming destructive political tribalism at home. She is also the author of World on Fire, How Exporting Free Market Democracy Breeds Ethnic Hatred and Global Instability, and Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, among others. In 2011, Professor Chua was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people, one of the Atlantic's brave thinkers, and one of foreign policy's global thinkers. She holds degrees from both Harvard University and Harvard Law School, where she was an executive editor of the Harvard Law Review. While this is Professor Chua's first appearance on the amphitheater stage, it is not her first time at Chautauqua. In Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, an entire chapter, Caravan to Chautauqua, documents an abbreviated family trip here from New Haven, which was not, as it turns out, a 3 to 4 hour drive, so that her daughter Lulu could audition for acclaimed violin instructor Almeda Vamos. Lulu later gave up the violin, much to her mother's chagrin, but all is well. She recently graduated from Harvard with a degree in history. Congratulations. Professor Chua's lecture today is entitled Overcoming Political Tribalism and Recovering Our American Democracy. Please join me in welcoming back to Chautauqua and for the first time to the amphitheater stage, Amy Chua.
Thanks so much, Jeff, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming this morning. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to be speaking to you today in this spectacular and big venue here at the legendary Chautauqua institution, and as part of a week with such illustrious other speakers. There are some really intimidating acts to follow, but I'll do my best. And of course, yes, this place brings back so many wonderful memories. It is, in fact, true that the last time I was here was about 10 years ago with my whole family, and the place made such an impression on me that I devoted a whole chapter to Chautauqua. So it is truly, truly a delight to be back. Special thanks to Matt Wald for inviting me and organizing everything so perfectly. So, by now, we all know that America is in the grip of political tribalism. We lament and we condemn this tribalism, even as we can't help voraciously engaging in it. But to solve any problem, we first need to correctly diagnose it. And by fixating on symptoms and constantly reacting to the latest outrage, and there are plenty of them, we can miss the root causes of the problem. So for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to do my best to clarify those root causes, to explain why it is that America is so bitterly divided today in the way it is, what we can do going forward to overcome this tribalism, and finally, why I'm ultimately optimistic about the future of our country. So, let me start by saying that humans, like our fellow primates, are tribal animals. That's just a biological fact. We are hardwired to be that way. We need to belong to groups. And once we connect with a group, we tend to want to cling to it and defend it and see our group as better in every way. In a fascinating recent study, children between the ages of 4 and 8 were randomly assigned to either the red group or the blue group. You wouldn't think that that would be such a meaningful distinction. But these kids were split, and half of them were given red T-shirts, the other half were given blue T-shirts. They were then seated at these computer docks and shown computer-edited images of a whole bunch of other children, half of whom were wearing red T-shirts, the other half of whom were wearing blue T-shirts. Afterwards, the children were asked for their reactions to these children in the computer images. The results were absolutely stunning. Even though these young kids knew absolutely nothing about the children in the images, the subjects consistently reported that they liked the kids wearing their color better, wanted to allocate more resources to people on their team, and perhaps most disturbingly, they displayed strong unconscious bias towards their own group members. That is, when they were told stories as part of the study about these kids and later asked questions, these kids exhibited systematic memory distortion, tending to remember all the positive things about the children on their side and all the negative things about the children wearing the opposite color. And these are just young kids divided along the flimsiest of lines. So humans are just a little tribal. We are very tribal. Once we belong to a group, our identities can become oddly bound up with it. Studies show that the effect is actually literally like a drug. It affects our brain. We will seek to benefit our group mates even when we personally gain nothing. We will take pleasure when out-group members fail or suffer a misfortune. Studies show that our brains actually light up when we stick it to the other side. Now, tribalism, nevertheless, is not necessarily a bad thing. Sports is a great example, right? Tribalism can be fun. Family can be very tribal. I'll be the first to tell you that I'm a very tribal person. The problem is when tribalism takes over a political system. That's when things get dangerous, because then you start just seeing everything through your group's lens, and facts and arguments start not to matter. Policies don't matter. You just defend them if your side is advocating them, and it doesn't matter if your side said just the opposite a year ago. And that's what we're seeing in America today. You stick to your tribe no matter what and try to take the other side down. That's why, at this moment, we can't get anything done, and we can't even talk to each other. We are at a point where many Americans see people who voted for the other side, not just people that they disagree with and want to debate with, but rather as immoral, evil, and un-American, which is a dangerous state of affairs. I have been studying tribalism outside the West for 20 years, and let me tell you, that is a recipe for breaking up, for countries breaking up, for civil war. At the same time, we are seeing in America a fracturing and splintering within groups, within the left, within the right, with ever-dividing groups pitting themselves against each other. So why? Why is this happening now? What is different about today? Well, two factors make this moment unprecedented. The first factor is the massive demographic transformation that this country is undergoing as a result of the immigration explosion that occurred after 1965. That's the same wave that brought my own parents to this country. They actually came to be graduate students, believe it or not. They eloped to MIT. That's not the first place I would elope to, but so for 200 years, America was dominated economically, politically, and culturally by a white majority. Obviously, white is a social construct, and who counted as white has always been a bit of a moving target. Jews, Irish, Hungarians were all groups that initially were not counted as totally white. But basically, that was the overall dynamic. Whites were in charge in every way. Now, when one group is so overwhelmingly dominant, lots of terrible things can happen. That group can oppress, it can enslave, it can persecute with impunity, but it can also afford to be more generous, more universalist, more inclusive, like the WASP elites of the 1960s who voluntarily opened up the Ivy League colleges to more Jews, blacks, and other minorities, in part because it just seemed like the right thing to do. Today, however, things are different. Today, for the first time in U.S. history, whites are on the verge of losing their majority status at the national level. The predictions usually put this at around 2044. Other predictions say 2050. There's some argument about exactly what this change will look like. But already a number of states are majority minority, a number of counties, and a number of major cities. So the result of this shift is that in America today, every group feels threatened. It's not just the minorities who feel threatened, whites feel threatened. I cite some really fascinating studies in the book. Over 50% of white Americans in America feel that they are subject to more discrimination than minorities. And over 67% of working class whites feel similarly. 67%. Today, it's not just religious minorities like Jews and Muslims who feel threatened. Christians feel threatened. You see this in the political dialogue, a war on the Bible. With President Trump in the office, women feel threatened. With the Me Too movement, men feel threatened. Straights and gays, Latinos and Asians, everyone feels threatened. And studies show that it's when groups feel threatened, that's when they retreat into tribalism. That's when they close ranks and become more insular and more defensive and more us versus them. And that's why we are starting to see a sort of form of very explicit identity politics on both sides of the political spectrum in a way that's quite different. I mean, we've always had identity politics, but in a way that's really very different. So on the right, we see openly anti-Muslim, proudly anti-Mexican, anti-immigrant movements. We see openly white nationalist movements, not just at nighttime, secretly, but holding conferences in D.C. that are covered by the Atlantic, something that would have been shocking just 3 or 4 years ago. There's a talk of war on whites, especially when it comes to education. On the left, there have also been very big changes in the progressives. For one thing, we've seen on the left a sharp shift away from inclusivity as a watchword, away from sort of group transcending and universalist ideals to a much more exclusionary approach. I see this so dramatically on college campuses. I teach at one of the most liberal campuses in the country, and I can tell you now it's very different from the civil rights movement, where there was talk of maybe someday we can all transcend groups where skin color doesn't matter. Today, on college campuses, group blindness is the ultimate sin. If you champion group blindness, you will be seen as erasing the very specific experiences of oppression of minority groups. So I see a lot more self-segregation among the different student groups. I mentor the Black Students Association, the Asian American Association, the South Asian Association, Outlaws, and all these groups. I will often say the same thing and say, let's do something together. No, they want separate sessions. You see a hardening of group lines. These groups are not in and of themselves bad. I support them. It's wonderful to have people you feel solidarity with. The problem is when those group lines harden so that you can't talk across group lines. Part of this is epistemological on the left. There's an idea now that people not in your racial or ethnic or gender group simply cannot understand you, cannot share in the knowledge possessed by in-group members. So you'll see a lot of rhetoric, you can't understand me because you're not a woman. You can't speak for me because you're not Black. You can't speak for me because you're not queer. The entire idea of cultural appropriation insists, among other things, that these are our group's symbols, our group's traditions, our group's patrimonies, and others have no right to them. You know, when I was growing up, I grew up 7 years in Indiana, and then we moved to Berkeley. It used to be a sign of sort of openness and multiculturalism for a Caucasian person to wear a sari or a kimono. Today, those would be considered acts of microaggression. So that is the first factor that is really shaping what we're seeing today. Because of the massive demographic changes, no group in America feels comfortably dominant. Every group feels attacked, persecuted, and pitted against other groups for jobs, spoils, university spots, and the right to define the nation's identity. But there is a second reason that explains the very specific kinds of political pathologies that we are seeing today. And I'm going to step back a little bit, because to explain this, I have to explain a phenomenon that I have been studying for 20 years. And this is the phenomenon of market-dominant minorities. Market-dominant minorities is a term that I coined in my first book, World on Fire, in 2003, to refer to tiny minorities viewed as outsiders by the rest of the population that control vastly disproportionate amounts of a nation's wealth. For example, the 3% ethnic Chinese minority in Indonesia that controls 70% of Indonesia's private economy. Just think about that. A 3% ethnic minority that speaks a different language controlling 70% of a nation's economy. Or the Philippines, where my own family is from, that only 1% ethnic Chinese minority controls about 60% of the Philippines' private economy and all of the country's major conglomerates. Again, my own family is Chinese from the Philippines. Or the 14% whites in South Africa or Zimbabwe. Again, a minority that is viewed as an outsider that controls a vastly disproportionate amount of the nation's wealth. When I first coined this term, I got in trouble. I seem to get in trouble for everything I write. And it was taboo. People were very uncomfortable. Americans, she must be stereotyping. But no, I document the actual control of these economies. And I don't think it should be taboo because the reasons for this dominance can vary widely, including, as in the case of South Africa, a history of apartheid and a colonial oppression. In any case, this phenomenon of market-dominant minorities is extremely pervasive in the developing world. They include Indians in East Africa, Lebanese in West Africa, the Igbo in Nigeria. The list goes on and on. Now, why is this phenomenon so important? The reason is because in countries with a market-dominant minority, democracy tends to be extremely destabilizing. Americans tend to romanticize democracy. We think that elections are the answer to everything. And I think we're now getting a taste of our own medicine. But for 20 years, I have been writing that, again, in more of the developing country context, that under certain conditions, especially when inequality tracks certain deep pre-existing ethnic or religious divisions, under certain conditions, democracy doesn't improve, but actually catalyzes group conflict. And very specifically, when in countries with a market-dominant minority that is viewed as controlling everything from afar and not caring about the majority, democracy can easily become an engine of catastrophic ethno-nationalism, pitting this big majority, long oppressed, poor, that's felt very excluded, pitting them, who are easily manipulated by these vote-seeking demagogues, against their former overlords. The most striking recent example of this, with a big impact for Americans, is Iraq. So, as Jeff mentioned, half of my book, Political Tribes, is actually about foreign policy and how our failure to understand the potency of tribalism in countries where we're trying to help has led to some of the greatest foreign policy disasters of the last 50 years. So in Iraq, we missed the depth of the division among the Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds. We missed the importance of tribal loyalties, but we also missed something much more specific, and that is that on the eve of the US invasion, Iraq had its own version of a market-dominant minority. This is the roughly 15% Sunnis who had dominated that country for centuries. First under the Ottomans, which was a Sunni power, and then under the British, who loved to do divide and rule and liked to rule through that minority, and most egregiously under Saddam Hussein, who himself was a Sunni, and not only favored Sunnis, but brutally persecuted the Kurds and the roughly 60% Shia majority, who also represented most of the country's poor. Writing in 2003, in the afterword to World on Fire, I very specifically warned that the sudden introduction of democracy in Iraq could be profoundly destabilizing. Specifically, I said, just think about the numbers. You've got this 15% minority that has controlled everything for so long and brutally persecuted the majority. What do you think that majority is going to do if you give them the vote? I predicted that Iraq's long oppressed 60% Shia majority would likely use their newfound political power for revenge against their former overlords, against that former market-dominant minority. And that's exactly what happened. Once in power, the new Shia Prime Minister Maliki immediately began excluding and persecuting and executing Sunnis. The Sunni minority instantly realized, this democracy thing is not working for us. We don't like it. So they began joining the insurgency, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So instead of bringing peace and prosperity to Iraq, democracy led to civil war, eventually giving rise to ISIS, which is a Sunni movement as targeted as the Shias, against the Shias as the West. So, with all that as background, this concept of market-dominant minorities, I now want to return to the United States. It used to be practically a defining difference between the United States and the turbulent developing world that we did not have a market-dominant minority. Just the opposite. For most of America's history, America was dominated economically and politically by a white majority, which sounds terrible to say, but a politically very stable, if also invidious, state of affairs. Economic and political power were in the same hands. But today, something has changed. Class or education has split America's white majority. Indeed, today there is now so little interaction and intermarriage between these two groups of whites in America, that is, between coastal, urban, more educated whites, and whites in the heartland, in the South, more working class whites, these two white tribes. Today, the division between these two groups of whites is so deep that it practically constitutes what social scientists would call an ethnic divide. A mark of an ethnic difference is intermarriage. How much do these two groups intermarry? Israelis and Palestinians, 0. And now, for example, it is much more common for a Caucasian person who attended Columbia or Cornell or Stanford and who lives in Manhattan or Chicago or LA to marry an Asian American or a Nigerian American or a South Asian American of similar educational background than it is for that person to marry someone from Appalachia. And this is something that J.D. Vance, of course, has been writing about. I don't know how many of you know, but J.D. Vance was my student. J.D. Vance, his book, I will tell you in Q&A, I have amazing stories. His book, Hillbilly Elegy, started off as a student paper for me. Exactly, I have the email, the exact same words. But JD has been writing about this enormously, and I just did a joint event with him at Aspen about 5 days ago, and he really spoke so movingly about this difference between his people, also white, and whites in more urban and coastal areas. And I won't do his experiment, but one thing he asked the group at Aspen is he said, "How many of you guys have passports?" I could probably ask you all, and I'm guessing that almost everybody would raise their hand. That's what happened at Aspen. He then said that in his community, in his city, the people he knew, almost none of them had a passport. So that's a phenomenon, too, that class has split America's white majority, and as a result of these two factors, these demographic changes, the browning of America, and this split among the whites, we may be seeing, for the first time in our history, the emergence of America's own highly idiosyncratic version of a market-dominant minority. Who am I talking about? Well, I am talking about the much discussed group often referred to as coastal elites. It's a misleading term because the members of this group are not all coastal. They could be from Cincinnati or Chicago. And they're not all elites, at least not in the sense of being wealthy. And they're also not all white. From the point of view of the heartland, the Harvard-educated, very professorial-sounding Barack Obama is the classic coastal elite. So it's not a perfect analogy. We're not talking about a single ethnic minority. Nevertheless, it remains the case that coastal elites bear a disturbing resemblance to market-dominant minorities around the world, of the developing world. It is, in fact, the case that wealth in the United States is extraordinarily concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of people, primarily living on the West and the East Coasts. This small group dominates key sectors of the economy, including Wall Street, Silicon Valley, the media, mainstream media, Hollywood, the top universities. Now, although America's coastal elites are not an ethnic minority, they're not all like Chinese and Indonesia, they're not a religious minority, they are extremely insular, interacting and intermarrying primarily amongst themselves, sharing the same cosmopolitan values, sharing the same progressive outlook, living in the same cities, vacationing in the same places, attending the same schools, and often viewed as extremely arrogant and condescending by people not in that group. Most importantly, because coastal elites are viewed by many in the heartland as always favoring minorities over whites, and as always wanting more and more immigrants, and as caring about the poor in Africa more than they care about the poor right here in the United States. Because of these characteristics, it's easy to depict these coastal elites as unconcerned with real Americans, indeed as threatening to their way of life. And what happened in America in November 2016 is exactly what I would have predicted for a developing country pursuing elections in the presence of a resented, market-dominant minority, viewed as controlling the levers of power from afar. What I would have predicted is just what we got: a rise of a populist movement in which demagogic voices call on real Americans to take back our country. A lot of people saw this in Make America Great Again, right? It wasn't explicit, but the idea is something's wrong. We got to get back to where we were. We got to make America like it was when we owned it. In fact, President Trump actually did say it's time to take back our country from the Mexicans and from China. So it's actually very illuminating to see Trumpism as part of a larger, much larger global phenomenon, not just as similar to the far-right movements of Europe, but as part of a global phenomenon. Over and over, you see these electoral slogans: Malaysia for Malaysians. It was not the Chinese. Whites out of Zimbabwe. This is our country. Bolivia for the indigenous Bolivians. And in fact, I want to share with you, I just want to see, I want to share with you at this point a little anecdote about how it was that I ended up writing the book that I wrote, Political Tribes. So I started writing this book about 3 years ago, and it was supposed to be completely a foreign policy book. To be perfectly honest, what happened is I got sick of being known as just the Tiger Mother. I was on the Bill Maher show about 3 years ago talking about Ukrainian nationalism, which I actually know quite a bit about, and I thought I did pretty well, not terribly, but afterwards on Twitter, there was all this horrible stuff. Why does this Tiger Mom woman think she can talk about Ukrainian nationalism? So I decided, oh my gosh, these people don't even know that I'm a professor. I got to get back to who I am. So I started writing this book about 3 years ago exclusively about how we tend in America to think of conflict around the world in terms of grand ideological divides, capitalism versus communism, or authoritarianism versus democracy. And because of these ideological blinkers, we are blind to the group identities that matter most to people on the ground, in the countries that we're trying to help. So the story goes, in February of 2017, that's just 1 month after President Trump took office, I was teaching a class that I have taught for 20 years. It's called International Business Transactions. It's the class that J.D. Vance was in. And I was making a point that I've made for 20 years, which is the dynamics in developing countries and non-Western countries are so different from our own that we keep messing up our foreign policy. And at a certain point, I look down and I'm reading, actually it's a passage from my own book, World on Fire, and I say that, you know, in developing countries, under certain conditions, demagogic politicians with no political experience can sweep to power in elections to the horror of elites, riding a wave of racially tinged populism. I was actually, believe it or not, I can show you the passage in my book. I was actually reading a passage about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And I remember I stopped short, and there were 80 people, 80 students, all staring at me, all thinking the same thing, which one woman finally articulated. And she said, "Professor Chua, it sounds exactly like you're describing the United States." And that was a light bulb moment for me. I had to change my own thinking, my own thesis. It was actually so illuminating in an interesting way. I immediately hired 30 research assistants from all different political stripes and backgrounds. I redid the whole book. And now, one of the main themes of the book is that because of the two factors I just described, this massive demographic change and the emergence of our own weird version of a market-dominant minority, the United States is, for the first time, starting to display destructive political dynamics that are much more commonly associated with developing countries. Ethno-nationalist movements, lurches towards authoritarianism, the erosion of trust in institutions and electoral outcomes. This one's tricky for this crowd. Elite backlash against the popular side of democracy. And above all, the transformation of democracy into an engine of zero-sum political tribalism. So, that's my diagnosis. How do we get out of this? Why did I say that I'm optimistic? What is the way forward? Well, I actually think that the answer is right in front of us. And I think that it lies in remembering what it is that makes America special, what it is that makes us different from other multi-ethnic countries like Iraq or Libya or even the countries of Western Europe. What is that difference? Alone among the major powers, America is what I call a supergroup. And let me explain. This is a very simple phenomenon, but I think it's really important. To be a supergroup, a country needs to satisfy two simple requirements. The first is you need a very strong, overarching collective identity, a national identity, American. But the second requirement is equally important. To be a supergroup, you have to allow individual subgroup identities, tribal identities to flourish. And this has been America at our best. This is a country where you can be Irish American, Syrian American, Japanese American, Cuban American, and intensely patriotic at the same time. And we just take this for granted. We don't realize how rare this is. Almost no other country in the world is a superpower. Take China. China is definitely not a supergroup. It's an incredibly powerful country, but it satisfies the first requirement, but not the second. That is, it has a very strong collective identity defined by the 92% Han Chinese, but it definitely does not let subgroup identities like the Uyghurs and the Tibetans flourish. Even a Western democracy like France is not a supergroup for very similar reasons. France has a strong principle of laïcité. It has a very strong collective French identity, but it does not allow subgroup identities, for example, their Muslim communities, to flourish in the same way that we do. There's a lot of what people consider forced assimilation, you know, about the restrictions on the headscarves and the scandal with the burkini ban a few years ago. That is the prohibition of the full-body swimsuits. And many people believe that these attempts at forced assimilation have backfired with France's Muslims, contributing to social unrest and radicalization. But the United States is a supergroup. And this is really important for a couple of reasons. It means that we do not need to choose between having a very strong group transcending collective identity and multiculturalism. We can have both. I think it's a false choice. If you notice right now, because of all the identity politics, there's been a flurry of voices and new books calling for liberalism again, a post-identity liberalism. And I love that vision. I think it would be great if we could all just be a country of individuals, group transcending all groups. But let me just tell you, that is impossible. It is impossible. It cuts against human nature to want to belong to groups. I speak as somebody that is such a patriotic American, but is incredibly proud of my ethnic Chinese heritage. My parents taught me that. I think it's telling people to shed their individual subgroup identities is like telling people to stop liking their sports teams. Can you imagine? Like, don't like the Buffalo Bills, just go for a nationwide idea. It's impossible. And that's why I like the idea of America as a supergroup. I think it is more true to the country that we are. And by the way, one of the reasons that we are able to be a supergroup when so few other countries are is because we have birthright citizenship, guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Under the US Constitution, if you are born in this country, you are an American citizen, no matter what your skin color, race, or creed, whether your parents are from Mexico, Somalia, or Iowa, as long as you are born on US soil. And again, we take this for granted. People forget how unusual birthright citizenship is. No Asian country grants birthright citizenship. No European country grants birthright citizenship. If anything, the trend is in the opposite direction. Ireland eliminated birthright citizenship in 2005. New Zealand eliminated it in 2006. But we have it, and it's extremely important. The fact that as a constitutional matter, being an American is not a matter of blood. It is not the province or preserve of any particular racial or ethnic or religious group. That makes us uniquely equipped to overcome the challenges of political tribalism. I have been traveling all over the country for the last 6 months. And everywhere I go, I'm repeatedly asked, just because people know that my focus is developing countries or other countries, over and over I'm asked, is there another country that can serve as a model for the United States to overcome our divisions? And I always respond, no, we are the model. America is the best model. We have the best apparatus, one that has allowed us to be more effective than any other country in the world at integrating an extremely diverse population. But of course, coming back to reality and the disheartening, in some ways, very ugly times we live in, we have to acknowledge that there is tremendous work to be done. In many ways, we are at a crossroads right now. It could get way worse. America's status as a supergroup is under tremendous strain. Our national fiber is being tested. But I deeply believe that recognizing what has made America special helps us see where we've gone wrong and provides critical insights for moving forward. So in my last 10 minutes, let me now offer 3 concrete suggestions for how we can start to come together, or at least move in the right direction. First, I think that we all need to be much, much more protective of America's special national identity. This is a lesson that both the left and the right need to take to heart, but in totally different ways. On the left, and some of you may not realize this because I have to tell you that the progressive outlook is very different among the younger generation. Very, very different. On the left, I totally agree that it is extremely important to expose the grotesque injustices of America's past and present, not to whitewash our history. The new exhibit at Monticello, incredibly important to be honest about the terrible stains on our history. But I also think that progressives need to be much more aware of the danger in the sort of scorched earth approach to U.S. history and ideals that I'm increasingly seeing, particularly on college campuses. It is extremely common for people to say America is a land of oppression, home of cowards. The filmmaker Michael Moore said America is a nation founded on genocide. Many, many prominent writers on the left depict America as a country rooted in the principle of white supremacy, structurally committed to white supremacy. Now, what I tell my students is there's a lot of truth to that, but there is a world of difference. It may just sound like words to you, but it's not. There is a world of difference between saying that America has repeatedly and shamefully failed to live up to its own ideals, and that we must do better. There's a huge difference between saying that and saying that the principles that we are supposedly founded on are all fraud, all lies, just smokescreens to disguise oppression. Because if America really is nothing more than a land of oppression, founded on nothing more than genocide and white supremacy, it's hard to see why America is even worth fighting for. The right poses equally grave dangers. America cannot remain a supergroup if we try to define our national identity, for example, through our immigration policy, in terms of whiteness or Anglo-Protestant culture or Christianity or any other term that is not inclusive of all colors and creeds. That would be a move in the direction of ethno-nationalism, away from what makes us special as a nation whose identity is rooted in principle, in an idea, not blood. More profoundly, conservatives often think, hey, at least we have patriotism. That's the one thing we have. Well, I always say conservatives need to remember that in a country like America, patriotism, real patriotism, is more than just waving a flag and singing the anthem very loudly. The kind of overarching national identity that a supergroup requires, capable of binding Americans together of all backgrounds, cannot exist unless every person in this society has reason to love the country, has reason to be proud of the country. If certain historically marginalized groups, if their reality is that they are not afforded the same dignity, the same respect as other more dominant groups, if their experience is that people who look like them are shot in the back for no reason, how can you expect them to think of this country as a great moral nation? So that is suggestion 1. We all need to elevate ourselves and be much more thoughtful about what it means to have a strong American identity, true to our history, and to realize that it takes work. Second concrete suggestion, we need to promote an experiment with concrete initiatives designed to make Americans start seeing each other as fellow Americans again. And a first step is to try to bridge the chasm between the coasts and the heartlands, between urban and rural. This chasm that is contributing to mutual ignorance, disdain, and stereotyping. And when I say that I'm optimistic, why? One reason that I'm optimistic is as I've gone around the country, I have discovered, and I'm sure of this, that if you just look beyond the loudest, most strident voices, the ones you hear on social media or cable news or Twitter, which is just horrible, just makes you want to just give up. I have found that if you just look beyond those echo chambers, I deeply believe that many, many Americans, most Americans, I believe, are wary of all the division and the acrimony and want to start reaching across divides. And in the last 6 months, thank you. Thank you. In the last 6 months, I have realized how ignorant I have been. I have been so excited and energized by all these organizations that I've started to hear about. There's something called Better Angels, which is a bipartisan group that tries to create debates among people from different sides of the political spectrum. There is something called Make America Dinner Again. I love this. I love this. This was started by two young women from the Bay Area that after the horror of the 2016 election for them began weeping, terrible depression, and then realized that they had never actually met a Trump supporter. So they started this program where they have small dinner parties with people who voted for Trump and people who violently opposed Trump. And you should find their website. It's amazing. High school students, putting us to shame, our generation, have reached out to me. I've heard about something called Next Generation Politics, a movement dedicated to promoting bipartisanship and civic engagement among Generation Z. That in just the last year has grown to over 50 high school chapters in 13 states. And another one, just last week, I mentioned that I was at Aspen. I did an event with Jim Fallows, who I know is here earlier this week, and J.D. Vance. And this was an event for a veterans group called With Honor, a group of veterans on both sides of the political spectrum, again, working tooth and nail, mobilizing to try to bridge the divides that are separating Americans. And I want to give you one idea of my own. Well, I thought it was my own, but I came up with this idea, and I actually have a bunch of students working with me on it, and I would love it if people want to join me. But then I started getting emails and realizing that so many other people have been thinking the same thing. And these other people include really famous people and 9-year-olds. And here's my idea. A kind of, well, I don't think we can make it mandatory at first, but a kind of national public service program. So, for example, right now, many of you I know have had kids or grandkids, and you know that right now it's very common for kids after high school to take a gap year. And what these, pretty privileged kids usually do, they go to Australia or Amsterdam or Guatemala, often with their also privileged friends, and they do great things. I love these programs. But what if we had a program where young Americans from the coast, from Manhattan or Berkeley, go not to a foreign country, but to somewhere unfamiliar in America where they would not ordinarily ever set foot, and then interact and work with young people their age on a common project? Gardening, building trees, infrastructure, not in a condescending way, like let's enlighten you, but really working side by side. I think that would be a wonderful first step in trying to bring the country back together. I'm out of time, so let me quickly tell you suggestion number 3. It's actually related to both. This goes back to education. America is changing. There is just no going back to the 1950s. We are in a period of renegotiating and rediscovering our collective identity. We are struggling, and it's painful, but we are struggling to arrive at a national identity that is capacious enough and honest enough to resonate with Americans of all sorts, old and young, immigrant and native born, urban and rural, the descendants of slaves and the descendants of slave owners. And to that end, I think that we need to think really hard about what values and vision of America our schools are instilling, from kindergarten through college, public schools and private schools. We need to rethink how we can teach our children U.S. history in the way that is honest, that tells the truth, while still conveying the idea of America as a special nation with a special constitution. And I really worry that this is getting lost. I was at an event, and a headmaster of a very, very well-known, very exclusive private school that you've all heard of came up to me and said afterwards, in private, he said, "I'm terrified. Because of the way we're teaching history right now, there are so many young people that now think of the Constitution as just a document written by dead white male rapists." It is important that we are no longer teaching our children a sanitized version of American history, but it is also important not to overcorrect. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were slave owners, but they were also political visionaries who helped give birth to what became the most inclusive form of governance in world history. To conclude, America is an aspirational nation. Our ideals have always far exceeded reality. The American dream is a promise of freedom and hope, but it is also a call on all of us to make true the myths we tell ourselves about what America has always been. The poet Langston Hughes captured this powerfully in his 1935 poem, "Let America Be America Again," and this is how I'd like to end. So this poem, there are two voices. It's very interesting. It begins with the first, a very hopeful voice that says, "Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. Let it be that great, strong land of love." But then a second voice interjects and says, "It never was America to me." Then the first voice says, "Say, who are you that mumbles in the dark?" And the second voice answers, "I am the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the black man bearing slavery's scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek. And finally, only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak." But far from concluding with defeat, Hughes offers a prayer and an affirmation. This is how he ends. "Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where every man is free. Oh, yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions. Thank you. Oh.
Thank you.
This is my favorite crowd ever.
Thank you. Thank you. If you are leaving for other appointments at Chautauqua, please do so quietly. The ushers will be around to collect your questions. And while we await the first question from the audience, Amy, I'd like to go back to this idea of fear and the threat in minority or majority. One might have thought in recent years that it was economically driven, but here we are at a time when clearly the economy is in good a shape as it's ever been. The unemployment rate is as low as it's been, and yet clearly these divisions continue to seem to get worse. And I'd like you maybe to spend a little time going deeper on where exactly do you think the fear is coming from?
Thank you. So after I'm often very frustrated with the public dialogue or what it is that people end up debating. I feel like it doesn't help anything. So after the 2016 election, there was this huge debate about whether it was racism or economic anxiety that brought Donald Trump to the presidency. And there were regression analyses and surveys and studies, and I was just never a fan of that because, first of all, you're talking about 60 million people. That's a lot of people. People voted for a lot of different reasons. I open with a story in Political Tribes. I have a student who's Mexican-American. His father is actually an undocumented immigrant. His mother and sister are also Mexican-Americans, and they voted for President Trump. Why? Because of the prosperity gospel. It was very interesting. So there's so many different factors, and I think that it's also a mix. That's why I like this idea of this kind of market-dominant minority idea. I think there's very much a feeling about we are losing our country. We are losing our country, and that's what you were saying, this fear of losing our country. And I just don't love the way, look, there are certainly terrible racists. You should see the emails and tweets I get. There are a lot of terrible elements in this country. But I don't think it's helpful to call large swaths of the population, 60 million of these names. And what I always like to say is, imagine if you were, let's take China. Or no, let's take the country of Nigeria. Imagine if Nigerians learned that in 20 years, that country would no longer, would be a majority white. If Nigerians learned that in 20 years, because of demographic changes, it would no longer be a majority black country. How would those Nigerians feel? Anxious. They would feel a lot of social anxiety. And now, is that racist? Maybe human, that goes back to a study I describe in the book, my colleague Paul Bloom. So the good news is that newborns are not born racist. But as of 3 months, he shows that white babies prefer white faces, Chinese babies prefer Chinese faces, Ethiopian babies prefer Ethiopian faces, and for obvious reasons. That's what your people surrounding you. So I think that there is a real fear that the country is changing, that it won't be the country that it was. I'm an optimist because we have encountered this before. We've seen nativist and anti-immigrant xenophobia waves happen before. Every other time we have overcome it. And what I say in the book is, let's not be the weak link. And I do think if we can just have some conversations, I think that we will get there.
2 questions actually already that wonder if Canada doesn't offer lessons for us, and aren't they also a supergroup?
I actually have studied Canada a lot. I hired 5 Canadians as my research assistants. So Canada, I think, is probably the closest example of a possible other supergroup, although I will tell you that many of my Canadian students are not completely sure that it qualifies. Canada definitely has requirement 2, multiculturalism, in magnificent form. But it's an interesting question whether Canadians have that same overarching collective identity that binds everybody together, especially when you take into account the interesting example of Quebec. And a lot of people who say that there is a strong national identity that connects Canadians say that the content of that national identity is actually multiculturalism. So it's just very different than the United States, where we have this kind of founding myth. So yes, of course we can always learn from other countries, but I will say that I've done the numbers also, and Canada right now actually is taking in more immigrants as a percentage of the population. I have all these in my book, but the numbers are so much smaller. That is, it's really no comparison. It's not a great comparison. Canada's population is much smaller. The size of the immigrant population, absolute size, it's much smaller. So I am not at all sure that without that very strong national identity, that they would be able to withstand the kinds of strains that we're feeling. You can see the new, I guess, is it mayor of Toronto? I mean, there are elements in Canada too. So it's an interesting discussion, but I don't think that we should, jump to simple conclusions.
How do we bridge the educational economic gap between those who feel threatened and coastal elites?
What I wrote in a New York Times op-ed from February is that I think that restoring upward mobility in this country should be viewed as a national emergency. One of the reasons that you get political tribalism, and again, it's so helpful. We tend to be very America-centric. How can this be happening to us? But if you look at other countries, you see the patterns. And it's often when people there's scarcity or there's a feeling of competition that you get the most invidious forms of group conflict. So education, I don't know. It's funny that I wrote the Tiger Mom book and committed myself to really doing well within the system. But I have to tell you, I think the system is just broke. It's so different from the way that I was as a kid. Here, it just seems like our young people, they have to study all the time from the moment that they're in 7th grade. They're worried about getting to these colleges. They have tutors. There's no time to play. They're overscheduled. And then there are so few university spots. And now with the affirmative action case against Harvard, you see minority groups pitted against each other. And I just feel like we're getting closer and closer to, China always had the terrible situation where you had billions of people competing through the Gaokao, the national examination, a handful of spots. And it almost feels like that's the way it is in the United States right now. So I think that I'm part of the group that thinks that a lot of things need to change. I think the system is just causing way too many people misery for what? Often just a huge load of debt. So I think there needs to be a lot of rethinking. I'm sorry I can't do a better job with that one.
Well, this one may be a little tricky for you also. If you could build a 2020 presidential candidate, what would this cyborg look like, think, and emulate?
Well, first of all, I think this is an incredibly important question because I think we need strong leadership. We need brave leaders because it is, and again, you see this when you look at the developing world, it is often much easier to get votes by playing to the base. And this is both on the right and the left. Getting people mad, fear-mongering, as you're saying, getting people to hate and to further divide. So it could really get worse before it gets better. So if you were to ask me, I think, this might be very controversial to say, but I think as much as so many people just loathe the president, they should see what it is that worked. I mean, again, putting aside, just how people feel, he, in many ways, believe it or not, seemed to speak authentically to his base. And I think that's how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez also won. This kind of authenticity, not just scripted, the same old things. So I would like to see somebody that is a little bit outside the box, not so predictable, not so canned, but who is somebody, I'm going to be very predictable here, but doesn't play to the base, that is trying to be more inclusive and to reach to the other side. And I think that's actually way braver than it sounds. It used to be that would be the normal, but I think it's actually, it might be harder to get people energized that way. So I think that's what I would look for, a sort of inclusive vision.
Is the tribalism a symptom of people's lack of communal connection and intense partisan information spheres?
Very much so. When I said that I thought restoring upward mobility should be viewed as a national emergency, part of that is actually geographic mobility. I don't know if you guys realize how much this has changed. You know, I mean, people, it used to be, this links to the education question. It used to be, not even that long ago, that you could grow up in the Midwest, Iowa, somewhere, and go to a public school, go to a local college, do well enough to be able to go to the coasts, succeed in California or New York, stay there, maybe come back. Right now, that is impossible. It is so expensive and difficult, even for elites, to get their kids into these top colleges. How can poor working class people with no knowledge of how this tutoring system and SATs work, how can they get their kids out there? And real estate is now so expensive. No one can afford to live in Manhattan or Silicon Valley or San Francisco. So this is part of what is contributing to this lack of interaction between Americans. People, there's no mobility. You can't move even geographically. It's hardened. And that's part of why I thought this idea of public service programs where you bring people from the coast. Honestly, the people who are poor from the middle of the country, they have fewer resources right now to just go and live in San Francisco. So I think it needs to be something more a policy, somewhat top-down initiative with really serious people thinking about how to put this program together, how to incentivize it, maybe through, I mean, I'm very hopeful about this because people do gap years anyway. And I will just give you another reason for optimism, which also answers this question. The last part of my book summarizes all these studies that show that if you can just pull people out of their tribal contexts, out of their groups, and have them really interact as human beings, it's unbelievable how fast progress can be made. It's not just putting them together. It's not just throwing them together. More diversity, exposure can often lead to more hatred, but it's really interacting with each other. And the best example of this was the integration of the military, US military, in the 1950s. What happened, some of you may remember this, but when this was first proposed to integrate the troops, there was enormous public opposition. It was like 80% against, both within the Army and public opinion. But after they did it, they did a bunch of studies, and first they found that the integrated troops were as or more effective than the all-white troops. They then interviewed people, and it was so inspiring. You can find these records. People said, you know, when you're, and this isn't just black and white. This is back when Italian Americans had never really met German Americans, who had never met Mexican Americans. And what the people interviewed said is, you know, if you are so far away from home, in a foxhole, missing your family in the same way, terrified in the same way, when you have to put your life in the hands of somebody else, you don't care what the color of their skin is. You don't care what accents they have. And that really brought Americans together. So we don't have the draft anymore, but that's why I like this idea of some form of a mechanism that can get Americans from very different economic and ethnic and religious backgrounds to interact in a way just as fellow human beings.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor Chua.